All right, I think it's time for us to get going. I am Tony Doss. I'm an interventional cardiologist who's one of the founding members for VIVA, and it is my great honor to co-moderate with Peter Schneider tonight on the 5 critical steps for creating the future of vascular disruptive devices. This comes from an initiative that VIVA has been committed to for some time, which includes research but innovation as well, which is why we're doing this webinar. I'm pleased to introduce Peter Schneider, my co-moderator, and Peter will introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into our presentations tonight. Peter?
Very good. Thank you, Tony. And thanks to everybody for joining. And as Tony mentioned, this comes from an effort that we've been interested in a long time and have pursued in various ways. And this is just yet another opportunity that we've had to share some ideas about device development. So the panel will consist of Aaron Armstrong, interventional cardiologist and medical director of the Adventist Heart and Vascular Institute, Kate Garrett, of Sonder Capital. Kate is an entrepreneur herself and has co-founded a couple of companies, been a CEO in developing and commercializing several products. Sophia Khan, who is a vascular surgeon at UT Houston, and who has also started a company and been involved in an entrepreneurship experience. And of course, Sean Lydon, chairman of vascular surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, which of course, a leading institution. So with that, shall we, Tony, would you like to introduce the first talk?
That would be great. Yeah, we have a really all-star cast of speakers that are going to present on a variety of topics, really from idea generation all the way to fundraising into commercialization. I think you'll really enjoy the presentations, in addition to which we'll have panel discussions in between. So without any further ado, let me introduce Todd Brinton, who's an interventional cardiologist by training, the chief scientific officer and corporate vice president previously of Edwards Life Science, but his story that he's going to discuss is turning a novel idea into a successful device. I'm sure you are all aware of the shockwave balloon intravascular lithotripsy, and Todd is going to teach us a little bit about how that came about.
Thank you very much, both of you, and the organizing committee for the invitation. So as you said, I'm now at Edwards Life Sciences, but I wanted to take some time to go back in time a little bit, and I actually took the liberty of pulling some old slides that I used when I was trying to get people to listen, which is probably the first message is, if you don't believe, nobody else will. And so I'm going to start with here. So there was actually some original slides that I used to present when I was trying to actually raise money and ultimately get some of really valuable advisors on board for the company. So the problem is, I think, probably one of the most important elements of understanding really the opportunity to develop a technology. And I think if I can't emphasize anything more than this, it's that the clinical need and the problem is something you got to go deep on. Because everyone wants to jump to their invention, but at the end of the day, your invention's only as good as the problem it's trying to solve. So, this Shockwave was built around, and Shockwave was built on a team. Many people were involved in it. Daniel Hawkins, myself, John Adams founded the company. Really a businessman, an engineer, and a physician. People that think very differently, and I would encourage everybody who's got an idea to surround yourself with people that think differently than you do. So this is based on this premise that vascular disease overall has really evolved, and this obviously was one of my favorite. This is the original angio, Andreas Grunzig's first angioplasty, and that was a different time, right? And the point is that the same tool we used then, we are still using today. And the idea was that the disease has changed, it's morphed, people are older, and calcium has become a significant problem and challenge for vascular intervention. And that the requirements for managing calcified disease reveal limitations, and that POBA in itself was a major limitation because you really were trying to tear open a vessel, and ultimately the injury was what caused most of the failure, either acutely or chronically. And I used to love the slide is that calcium is the enemy of the interventionalist. It makes everything harder, more expensive, more complicated than it used to be, and as a result, we need to think differently about the way we approach the problem. So this is from the textbook I remember pulling and putting this slide together, a decade ago. Shockwave is kind of evolved and gone on to be what it is today, and hopefully those of you who've had the opportunity to use it see its value. But when we were starting it, the overnight success, people say, was started back in 2008. So another message is it takes a long time. It's a long journey. But I pulled this from a textbook, but this was the problem we really were trying to solve, which was, the significant difference in vessel compliance in calcified lesions that ultimately led to dissection and acute failure and ultimately injury. And this was what we were trying to overcome. And so this was actually a slide I presented many times, which was, what problem are we ultimately trying to solve? And that was dilation without injury. And that seems like a crazy idea, like how could you ultimately dilate a vessel without popping it open? But the existing technologies were hard to deliver. They had excessive time and equipment in the cath lab. You could usually tell the complexity of a case by the amount of equipment that was sitting on the back of the table. And ultimately, our goal was to create we created excessive mechanical injury, either acutely or chronically. And the solution we sought was basically a lesion modification that prior to dilatation using lithotripsy. And this idea was, how are we going to actually find a methodology to approach that? And the idea was it would already existed. Extracorporeal lithotripsy has been around a long time. It's how we break up kidney stones. And so we used external mechanical energy and ultimately to fracture calcium to make the pieces smaller to ultimately pass through the ureter. And so this already existed. So the goals were, could we apply this same fundamental technology inside a balloon to actually impact patients? So I wanted to show you a little bit. These are some of the first experiments we actually ran. This is actually John Adams that ran this experiment. And so just to give you just to illustrate it for a moment, we kind of said, well, we have this idea, but how do we know it's going to work? And this is inside an eggshell. And so for those of you that know Dave Auth, who was the founder and developed a rotoblader, he used to take and burn the outside of an eggshell. And so we said, well, if we put this inside a water bath and put a pair of electrodes, ultimately and created lithotripsy inside a balloon, we would fracture through that small membrane, much like the internal elastic lamina or the endothelium, and we could actually fracture the calcium on the outside. Now, the question people asked was, where's the calcium going to go? A question we got for years, and ultimately it was the perfect situation. The calcium's embedded in the vessel wall. It's not going anywhere. We just wanted to fracture it and make it more compliant. So this is an example of the dose effect. We could fracture once. This is eggshell into gelatin, and ultimately get a fracture that kind of bifurcated. We could shock multiple times and get more fractures. And so I remember Daniel Hawkins used to say it's like fracturing, your windshield. The more you crack it, the more flexible it became, safety glass. This is also from one of our earliest experiments that I did with a colleague in a small lab we built. And this was to demonstrate, whoops, let me go back here. See if I can get this to run. To demonstrate basically the ability to actually put lithotripsy inside a balloon. So we advanced this as using POBA to show that we were trying to like this surrogate calcium tool, and basically the balloon's inside of it at 4 atmospheres. We decreased it to half an atmosphere and ultimately then went back and actually added 1 pulse. And you could see we could fracture open the calcium. Now, people didn't want the vessel to blow up like that, and obviously it didn't. And so the idea was these were fundamental steps along the way to try and demonstrate the feasibility of the idea. This was in chronic animal studies that demonstrated that we could take POBA versus POBA with lithotripsy inside of it. We had to show that the lithotripsy, those actual mechanical shocks, didn't have a terrible effect on the vessel wall. And so we ended up running a trial in animals, comparing POBA without shocks to POBA with shocks at 4 atmospheres, trying to show the feasibility that these mechanical shocks did not ultimately have a negative effect on the vessel wall. An important step in that process. And so then it was on to humans. And Andrew Holden, who's well known to this group, I remember actually at this meeting 8 years ago sitting with Andrew and showing him these slides and saying we wanted to go to humans. And ultimately I'll show you the first case we did with Andrew Holden in New Zealand. And that protocol was we took patients and we figured the best place we could actually start was the leg. We thought about starting in the coronary, something where I had observed the problem that started this entire journey, but ultimately went to the leg. And so we took patients that had symptomatic claudication, had decreased ABIs, and had MRAs of the lower extremity, and were diabetics, and ultimately said, okay, let's see if we can actually put a kind of mocked up balloon. It was actually a commercially available lithotripsy device. It was used for kidney stones, and wrapped a balloon around it and demonstrated feasibility in humans. And this is actually that first case. So we OCT'd this case. It's a SFA, heavily calcified, very focal lesion. Obviously very difficult to find a very focal lesion because we only had a small balloon that was 20 millimeters in length and had a single electrode in the middle of it. We ended up OCTing it before the case and ultimately positioning this 20 millimeter balloon sitting right in between. You can see the heavy calcium, and then ultimately applied lithotripsy. You can see here on the left, and then ultimately after the lithotripsy, ultimately the effect we had by fracturing the calcium and then dilating the balloon just to nominal so we didn't overstretch the vessel. You can see the angio over on the right. Now, not perfect, but significantly improved over what we had before. Importantly, that question that came up, well, what happens to the calcium? That was the filter you see down on the left, and that was one of the first questions Andrew said we had to solve, which was, what happens to the calcium? And what happens to this exophilic calcium potentially in some of these cases? And in fact, in many of the series cases, the first series of cases we did, we always had filters in place. And almost we only had one event where we ever had any calcium actually distally embolize. So the conclusions of kind of the talk I'm giving was that early on, and these again were the original slides that you used to pitch, was that IVL, as it's known now, was a novel technology for treatment of calcified vascular lesions. We thought we'd demonstrated that. And the early week demonstrated, most importantly, safety in animals, and early clinical studies were kind of ongoing. And that the early clinical experience demonstrated the effectiveness for treatment in highly calcified SFA and popliteal lesions, but now, I think many of you know, it's below the knee, it's above the knee, it's actually in the iliacs, and there's a coronary product that now we've had a clinical trial that demonstrated that feasibility and efficacy, and now the commercially available coronary products. And so this was from the end of 2012. Current development of a coronary platform. Well, we're obviously come a long way from there. So most importantly, as they say, it takes a village. It did. Many people in this room actually had big impact on the shockwave story as to where it is today. Most importantly, the patients that were willing to actually step up and actually be willing to participate in clinical trials and demonstrate the effectiveness so others could benefit. The team, it took a village, a huge team, and I want to thank everyone that was involved, and the early team and the team that's there now, the investigators, our advisors. Most importantly, you'll hear probably from others, the importance of really valuable advisors that will tell you the truth, good investors that are willing to go the distance, and we were very fortunate to have a great board of investors and others, regulators, and also one important piece that everyone forgets about, payers. You got to drive value. You have to bring value to patients. And so in order to do that, you got to have partner with all these agencies. So thank you very, very much.
That was an amazing talk, and we all know that the shockwave story is a great story, and it's a situation where an idea that had kind of come up in the course of an actual clinical practice turned into something that was on the shelf at a later time. So it's a great story. And I'm just kind of wondering, a couple of the things that Todd mentioned really resonated with me. One is this idea of surrounding yourself with people who maybe think a little differently. And I could just say from my own experience that when you talk to engineers, when you talk to intellectual property attorneys, you talk to CEOs, operators, business people, or you talk to those who typically invest professionally, whether they be venture capital or private equity or whatever venue they choose, all of these folks really, they think about things differently. So I'm wondering, Kate, let me just ask you if I could just come to you for a moment, since you've had a variety of experiences. Do you have a sense of when you're trying to get your idea off the ground, what kind of team do you need to build? Where do you start?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. And especially, where do you start when you don't really have any money, which is often where, and I think, and I've been in that situation. I have many friends who are entrepreneurs. I think the first, as Todd said, it start with the clinical need. Don't start with the technology. So first, surround yourself with clinical advisors. All of you are incredibly talented clinicians, but you have to have, you don't want to just be believing yourself. You've got to surround yourself with other clinical advisors you can get input from to validate what you see as the clinical need and the criteria that are required for success. And then the next step, once you have that, your clinical kind of roundtable that's helping you think through how to solve the problem, it often starts with some kind of technical proof of concept. And the thing I love about Shockwave is, as an investor today, we talk about this a lot. There aren't that many stories like Shockwave that go from a concept to a $6 billion market cap company in a decade. I mean, it's really one of the few. But even Shockwave started with a very basic egg model. I mean, they were cracking eggshells, and that's something that's approachable, right, for all of us as early entrepreneurs to think about. You don't have to have 100 patient data to convince an investor, right? You can start with something simple and approachable. So then after the clinical feedback, I would, you recommend going out, finding somebody who can help you develop a technical proof of concept model.
The another thing that Todd alluded to that I thought was really interesting and goes straight to the heart of why we're even here and why we even get up in the morning is he kind of said, I can't remember the exact words, but he said something like, it's a privilege to have other people think your idea is a good idea, or to invest their time, their energy, their money in your idea. And yet, he didn't say this, but I know just from my own experience that almost everything we do now is so device dependent. Many of the very challenging cases we couldn't do before, we can do now because we have better devices. And I think a lot of folks that are on my end, on the pure clinical end, imagine that devices fall from the sky like rain. Like, of course, it's a new decade, there must be new devices. It's a new year, there must be more funding. And it's just not like that. So I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to comment on this. I know, Sean, you're the chief of a massive department at a major institution. You guys use a lot of devices. How do things look on the institutional end for device procurement? How do they think about these? I may be in my garage, cracking eggshells or, doing something. But what does Cleveland Clinic say about whether I have a chance to get it on your shelf ultimately?
So I'll use Shockwave as the example. So I helped set up and run the new product evaluation committees here. And so Shockwave comes out, I saw, Marianne Brodman present it from the data from Europe, and you see the first case is a live case getting done from Link. And you say, wow, that was a really, really calcified vessel. And it looks pretty good after angioplasty. So you're like, hey, I want to try it. And then you want to go try it and you realize, man, it's $4,000 and I'm going to use it for an angioplasty. And my hospital's payment for that is less than the device itself. And so, immediately when you bring it to the hospital, like, wait a minute, it costs more than we get paid. And that's just for the balloon. Like, you guys are insane. And so where Todd said you got to involve the payers, I think one thing Shockwave did is they went and met with the payers. And once they had clinical data to show value, now there's a new reimbursement code. But I mean, it was a very difficult uptake to the clinic to say, hey, I got friends using it and it's working in places where nothing else does. It's meeting an unmet clinical need. So we put all these stopgaps to make sure that there were 3 or 4 peers that would validate before we use it, because we knew every time we used it, if that's the only technology we used, we're going to lose money. And for the bean counters administrators, that was a big ask. And so we've tried to sit there and say, hey, we don't want to not touch new technology, we want to do it, but you got to understand, like, when it's breaking the bank, you really want to make sure it derives patient value on the other end.
Very good. Thanks, Sean, for that. I think, why don't we go ahead to the next presentation, which I think everybody will find interesting and dovetails nicely with the first, and that is that I'd like to introduce Brian Dowdy, MBA. He's the CEO of Delta Force, formerly a VP of operations at CSI. And Brian's going to talk about the next steps along the road.
I want to thank the clinicians out there that give their time and their heart and soul to help patients. I want to thank the innovators that help those clinicians do a better job day in and day out. There's my faculty disclosure. What you'll see there is I've been on all sides of this equation that's in your head right now, I think I have an idea. I've been in the big companies, the startups, et cetera, and I think it's given me a pretty interesting viewpoint to answer the question, what do I do? How do I do this? I have an idea. Okay, so here's a few facts I like to start with. Right now I get, let's call it deal flow, or ideas come to me from clinicians, the actual doctors that specialize in a particular procedure, engineers, different entrepreneurs come. And a fact is that it's very rare that somebody brings an idea that they're excited about that I don't think we need or that wouldn't be beneficial. And 25 years ago when I was a younger man, if it was a good idea and your colleagues would use it, you might have a shot. Today we're going to talk about what's the rest of the story. And it's amazing how many, I really call them retreads, but how many ideas actually make it all the way through the process. They had the idea, they cleared the IP, they had the investor, and they even got an FDA approval or clearance, but they rarely result in an exit, the ability to monetize the idea. So an example of that is a device that for every reason you can think of should be a success, but they can't exit. This happens far too often. What we do at Delta Force is over 25 years, I've been a student with a lot of help from people up here and out in the audience, a student of when you win, when that doctor in this case has an idea and they actually impacted healthcare. I was part of cardiovascular systems and it was so fun that now we're in every cath lab that is in the US. So, that's important and it's a really interesting thing to work on. But what I started to do as I was a student of this, why did CSI work? And why didn't it? Why did Shockwave work? Why do a lot not work? And so if you really dig in and you look at when you win why with your idea and when you fail why, you can actually put that into an objective scoring system. And so we call this Delta Force vetting. I'm going to talk about it. That's the main point of the talk. But hundreds of ideas come every year, and they rarely pass this vetting that I want to describe and give to you. So why are there so many failures? The causes of failures fall into one of these three buckets. The first failure in 25 years of studying why do you win, why do you lose, is that you don't vet it correctly. I'll never forget the first time we were taking a company public. And all these folks came in from Midtown Manhattan, and the lawyers, the underwriters, and they went to some schools I know I couldn't have gotten into. And I'm so fascinated to see how are they going to vet this. And I was shocked at how little vetting actually happens. I'll give you one more example. I was at Medtronic, and I won't say the division, but we had an acquisition. I wasn't part of the business development team at the time. And we that were selling the products, the commercial team, were like, who decided to do this? Well, the vetting's insufficient. I'm going to show you how to do it right. Insufficient vetting is the first bucket you fall into. Let's think about this for a second. If I'm a specialist doing a particular procedure, and I know my device makes it better, and you think, well, I vetted it. I talked to my colleagues. Would you use this? Would this be helpful? That is maybe like 3 or 4% of the vetting that needs to be done. More on that in a minute. The second reason they fail is the development model was wrong. You hear this term thrown about often now, fractional. Everything from a fractional CFO to a fractional CMO. Well, in the old days, when we did startups, we had the good idea, we did the IP, we got the funding, then we rented a building or space in a building, and we started to bring on full-time people. And what we found out is we spent far more money than we needed to. There are different models. You can do this all with consultants. You can get the building and hire the full-time heads. You can do this in a fractional model. And what I'm here to say is there's not one model that fits every idea you have. It's important to consider the models. The third thing is you cannot commercialize it. So if you look at those three buckets, this idea about commercializing, and by that I don't mean that you're ready to go to market, you have a sales plan, you have some targets. True commercialization these days is you have to show a potential acquirer, if that's your exit strategy, you have to show them actual market uptake data for your device. In the old days, they wanted the strategics to buy your device early, before good news, so that they could ride the value wave. These days, it's like not just reduced risk of what they're going to buy, it has to be almost no risk. So it's difficult if you can't commercialize. Now that commercialization, calculus thinking has to happen up front. when you're doing the vetting. So here's the vetting that I want to describe. Typical is you have an inventor, might be a clinician, and through their experience, they think, I've got this great idea. Talk to a few colleagues, quick IP check, and then they go see the strategics. And so you go see a business development person at one of the booths, and everything looks good. That's like a lot of times where the vetting stops. Here's what's actually required. Here are the things I want you to think about. I want you to think about if you would a bicycle wheel, and you're at the hub, and these bullet points over to the right are spokes. So first of all, how big is the market? Like you'll see, okay, well, my market's 5 billion. Well, what's the addressable market? Your idea, what part of the market, in other words, if you take market share from an incumbent, where is it coming from? How big is that? An agreement with the strategic isn't someone that's at a meeting like this telling you they like your idea, they'd be interested. When you're talking to the strategic, you want to know who are the people that carry the P&L for that division or that company for the next 5 years. And you want to find out from them, what's in their 5-year plan? How are they going to hit the growth numbers that they owe to the corporate headquarters? And you have to have an agreement with the strategic. What do they think the size of the addressable market is? How accretive could your idea or device ultimately be? And now here's one that you can't miss these days, is you need to go to the integrated delivery network. And you have to find out what the contract situation is. Could they ever even use your device or allow their member physicians to use it? It's really important. Then, of course, the more traditional things. Who's in the market today? Why do they win? Why do they fail? Reimbursement's one thing, but you need to be looking forward. What types of things are being discussed in the reimbursement world that would impact your device? The technique elements. It's very difficult to come up with something novel to solve a real problem and then get clinicians to change the technique substantially. Finally, midway here is the cost of goods and the average selling price. I can think of 3 devices right now that are great devices. If I was the patient, I would want it. They're cleared by the FDA. Everything should be good, but the cost of goods, that IDN is saying, no way. We heard about don't forget the payer. Imagine that. I would want this device, you would want this device to be used on you, but it's never going to be successful because you can't get in it due to the cost of goods. I'm thinking of one device right now where I was talking to an engineer subsequent, and I asked them, could you have done this or this? And they said, we could have. No one told us we should. Well, by not doing what they could have done, their ASP, average selling price, is far too high. The likely regulatory time and path and the development model match to the above. So again, you might want to get full-time heads and go. You might want to do it fractionally. It's important that you consider that. Commercialization plan and cost, IP, and then prospective funding sources. So if you're out there today and you're listening to this talk going, I do have an idea, how do I go about this? Vet it this way. It's multiple points. It takes a little bit more work up front, but it's really, really important because it will predict whether you'll be successful or not. So if you're a doctor and you have an idea, no doubt you have a suspicion, if you're talking about this at all with your friends and colleagues, your idea, you think it has clinical value. But I'm telling you, the big piece of the vetting is the commercial value. How will it be accretive? Where will you take the market share from? This is really an important piece of it. Are you fundable? If you're not a real company with, basics, financials, a data room you can show somebody. This is all easy to do, but the question is to go out and talk to the different funders and see, is there an appetite? One of the big reasons of failure is somebody gets moving along and then they can't raise additional money. And then finally, that's not a real word, but I put it in quotes, are you exitable? Do you have interest from either Wall Street to do an IPO or from a strategic that might want to do the acquisition? So this is what we look at when we vet it. Just in closing, there's a bunch of things we look at for the clinical score. That's what most doctors are good at. They get through that step. The commercial score's got different things to look at, the exitability, the fundability, and then the overall venture score. The good news is that if you do an approach like this and you score it out, are you going to have 10 out of 10 on everything on the 54 points? For sure you won't. But where the gaps are, the blind spots are, if you're aware of those, you'll know how to go after it and how to prioritize it. This is an example of what that scorecard looks like. By the way, in 8 years of doing this particular system, the average idea that comes to me, I scored it at an average 2.5 out of 10. So that'd be good to know up front. These are some of the stakeholders that are part of the scoring and the vetting, and what it delivers is a yes, no, and it delivers, if it's yes, how should I go about it? Thank you very much.
So I really, I love that talk because it's encouraging, but it's also kind of sobering to think about what you have to go through to really make this work. I'm going to ask Sophia to weigh in on this. She's thought about an idea. She's now built a company around that idea. So talk to me a little bit about, were you more encouraged or less encouraged after hearing what Brian had to say regarding an idea? And is the space of medical device different than the digital world that maybe some of the newer funding may be coming towards? I'd love to hear your ideas on that.
Yeah, I'm almost like, wow, I want to put my company through that vetting force. It is really hard to vet because if you're a physician founder and if you're like me, I think one thing you forgot about is excitability. I came up with a product idea and I was like, this is going to make $1 billion and we're going to be ringing the bell at the stock exchange. And it's really humbling because that's just your mentality as a physician. You're like so gung ho. You're like, this is going to be it. Every doctor wants to do it. And, you know, I talked to my co-founders and advisors and they're like, that's not how, the business world works. So we're not trained in that. There's no businesses, there's no entrepreneurial class you take in med school or even in residency. So I think it's really important. When we went through the process, we actually talked to 100 physicians to make sure that this wasn't just a Sophie idea. So I think it is, really important because especially in the market that there is right now, like you have to, it's a long game. It's not even digital health. I think digital health has made kind of a turn. Before it was like you had a PowerPoint and venture capitalists were writing you big, 6-7 figure checks. And now they're like, well, we want to have traction and we want to know what your exit strategy is. So I think all of those things that they talked about are so important. And it is really, really important to have, if you don't have a business background, to surround yourself with people who do understand that, because I guarantee you my company would not have survived if I was doing this on my own, because I would have driven it to the ground. I would have been like, sure, we'll spend $200,000 on that and we would be broken. I wouldn't be at this conference, this webinar right now.
That's great. I mean, it sounds like the team is really in so many ways, as they describe, more important than the device or the idea in so many ways. And I think that many on this webinar have proven that. I'll just ask Aaron. Aaron, you've done so many clinical trials and been involved with so much early stage devices. As you look from your vantage point at things that come at you for clinical trial and clinical trial design, et cetera, what interests you from what you heard Brian say that makes you think this device is going to make it or not make it, in addition to the clinical piece? I'm really curious to hear from that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. I have had the opportunity to evaluate a fair number of early stage devices, as have many other people here on the panel. And I think that, there's so many factors that play into that. I think that, when we're working on devices that are earlier on in phase 1 or phase 2 or pre-approval, there's a lot of questions about the workflow and how that's going to integrate in the cath lab. I mean, the reality is that makes a difference. If something, can be done 2 or 3 minutes faster, then that's going to add up to the time and the workflow of the cath lab. I think that, is it for many physicians who are not early adopters, does it build on something that's a process that we already do? I think that's why Shockwave is, to me, is such a great example too, because it takes the fundamental angioplasty and then utilizes it in a totally different way. I knew immediately when I started using that device that it was going to be adopted by many, because my other partners who are not usually early adopters immediately started using the device as well. And so I think those factors, so I think those factors really do play into the how things are utilized in the workflow. Of course the payment aspect of it matters too, but I think as physicians, all of us want to do what's best for the patient. And so if there's something that also has the data that really supports that outcome, then that is going to be a driver of the adoption as well.
It sounds like it. And I think you expressed what Sophia expressed, which is excitability. If you got excitability, then fundability may follow that, hopefully. Well, let's move on to the next presentation to keep on time. This is probably the interesting one that I think that many will find fascinating, is how do you raise money for your idea, and what interesting elevator pitches and lessons in dilution might add to your decision about beginning a device company. So Louis Cannon, who's the founder and managing partner of BioStar Capital and a good friend, gives this presentation. I think you'll learn a lot from it. Let's hear from Louis.
Pleasure to be up here. Honored to be part of this panel. Thank you all. So there's the disclosure, but just so you know where I'm coming from, I am an interventional cardiologist, left practice 2 years ago, had some patents that were licensed to a couple big companies, decided to go into venture capital, and now actually we're on our 5th fund. So, you know, I can see things in a manner that it's very important in terms of the clinical impact that we make, but also I need to make a dollar. So elevator pitches. Numero uno, know what you have and know what you don't have. Also know who you are and who you are not. So if you've been a practicing cardiologist for 30 years and you have an idea and you want to be a CEO, but you also want to do cardiology, you also want your family and 100 other things, don't expect to be a CEO through that company because it's probably not going to happen. Keep the elevator pitch short. Not short, but short, short, short. I want to know about the technology, the round, the raise, and the use of proceeds. If it takes me 3 or 4 pages on an email, you know, I'm a type A personality and I'm not real good at patience at all. Ask my wife, ask my kids. So it's got to be really short. It's got to be really concise if you want us to move on. It's okay to attach the deck. The deck should have enough details about the innovation, but if it's got a bunch of videos and you're telling me about hypertension and the market in the United States and how every strategic is involved, I'm not going to give you the time of day because you've lost street credibility, at least in my opinion. Try and personalize it. If something comes and says, "Hi, Lewis," or "Hi, Mr. Cannon," or they spell BioStar wrong, or it comes from an investment bank, almost all of that stuff goes to trash or deleted email. So try to find a way, if you can, to personalize things. In one paragraph, elucidate the field, the technology, and the market. Avoid bullshit, BS. It may work for angel investors, but it's not going to really work for investors that have been around the block multiple times. So before anyone really shows you the money, be sure you have an idea that is more than an idea. You know, we talked about a company, something that makes clinical difference. Is it at what we call a shtick? And often something will come in, I'll send to my partner's shtick, you know, drop it. That just means it's an iteration, it's a shtick, it's an idea, it's not anything that we want to get into. So is it an iteration or a transformation? If you have an idea right now for Shockwave, you know, let's say you've got an idea for a second balloon on top of it, forget it, because Shockwave owns that, and chances are they've thought about it 100 times. If you come up with a new wire that has a middle core and a core on the outside and wire costs are virtually nothing, that's an iteration that's not going to go anywhere. A transformation makes a clinical difference. It's consequential. It usually has intellectual property, makes a difference in patients' care. You want to impact patients' lives and physicians' lives. That's really what we all try to do. So also look what's already been acquired, what's developed in-house, because you may look at something going on at Edwards right now in their valve, but I assure you they're 3, 4 generations ahead of that. So be careful you're not shooting a bird where the bird is. You have to shoot the bird where the bird's going to go. So here's some examples of transformational innovations that we've been involved in. I'm not going to, focus on this a lot, but something like atrial appendage occlusion, been there, done that. There's a dozen of them out there now. So it was transformational. It's not anymore. Shoulder cuff, a bioabsorbable cuff. That was a great innovation. It was bought by Stryker. It avoided narcotics, et cetera, allowed physical therapy for those that couldn't have surgery. But now there's a lot of iterations that are out there. Same with, a lot of these. Also understand the time frame. Like Todd said, I think 2003 is really when he came up with Shockwave. If you take a look at something like the robot, Corindus, which we were intimately involved in prior to the Siemens acquisition, also think, is a hospital going to pay $300,000 or $400,000 for something that avoids the doc having lead on? If they can get another doctor for that amount of money. So you really have to understand, is there a return on investment? Corindus worked because we were able to really say, hey, not enough neurointerventional radiologists, there's stroke therapy, et cetera. So it became a transformational idea from what I think was actually a relatively boring technology. So what's your first money in? First money in, angel investors. Okay, you're talking to your mom, you're talking to your dad, you're talking to the Buick dealer, you're talking to someone who you saved their life, you know, if you're a doctor. An angel investor doesn't have a fiduciary responsibility to anyone else. No one has given them their money and said, invest this for me, and I'm going to hold you accountable. So there's no one to answer to. So those are the first people I think that you really want to go to. Keep in mind, they don't do follow-on rounds often. They're all individuals, and they all may put in 25 or 50 or 100,000, but you know, they age, and their family may not want to continue it. So then there's venture capitalists. So I'm going to put the cigar in my mouth for this for a second, all right? Because we got the money. And you want the money, okay? So what happens? We're the first institutional round, and I can tell you sometimes it's not pretty. This is what's going to happen. And I'm going to talk about dilution a little bit. Money talks. If you've got a great idea and you don't have money and you want money, you've got to give something for that. So here's the periodic table of healthcare, and here's just some of the groups that you're going to want to go to. Our group over here, unfortunately, is what's called a micro cap. I hate that. We're now raising a $175 million fund, but right now that's nothing, to be honest with you. So, but you're going to start kind of in the micro cap area before you get to an NEA or a Deerfield. If they're a $1 billion+ fund, they're not going to invest $1, $2, $3 million, because if they get a 10x on that, it's 30 million, and that doesn't even cover a small percent of their administrative fees. So really know who you're trying to target. So then there's the impact of the strategic investor, and we have some of these here, Edwards, and we've got Jeff Mervis from Boston. They're more and more common, and in my opinion, they provide a lot of validation. They can be valuation insensitive, but they add value in a lot of ways. Now, the alternative argument for that on a board member is they may turn off another investor. If you have Boston Scientific on and Merv's at the table, Medtronic may not be excited about being at the table as well. They may not do follow-ons. You know, right now the market's huge, but sometimes it plummets, and they've got to, think about their stockholder, et cetera. But that impact investor, I think, is very important. So here's dilution. And this is you. Great idea. Maybe you're a cardiologist. Maybe you're an inventor. And there's the nut that's between your teeth. So here's the angel money that came in. Here's how the cap table looks, and I put it in a circle because I don't know who's relatively looking at cap tables, but there's a percent. You save the guy's life, and that's your mom. You own 75% of the company. So here comes the money. Let's take a look. You were purple. So here's the bright idea guy. You went from about 75% to about 25%. Here's the benevolent VCs you can see over here. And here's mom. And mom wants to know when she's going to get her $5,000 back. You got to go home and you say, mom, not going to be able to do that for a decade or more. So here's round after round. So it's a new cap table, and you got to understand you're going to probably lose 80% of the company. By the way, here you are up here, and I gave you the benefit of the doubt because I couldn't make this small enough to include mom. Mom's really got a sliver at this point. So understand what's going to happen to you. This is you, the investor. This is after you've bitten the nut, okay? There's no teeth left. You're going to be angry. You're going to be aggravated. It's your idea. You're fantastic. But this is really what happens with dilution. It's just a fact of life. So in conclusion, keep the elevator pitch short. Technology, what's the tech? What's the raise? What's the money going to be used for? And keep in mind, it's not going to be the only round. There's going to be an A, a B, and a C. Hopefully maybe you go IPO if you do have a company or someone acquires you. I prefer the acquisition to the public stock because then you have to deal with public stock. Is it an iteration or is it a transformation? Start with the wealthy individuals, and then you got to go to the VCs because they got the money. And they are the sharks. They're going to be tough out there on you. Impact investors, really, think about those impact investors because they really have a lot of knowledge. They really understand acquisition, research, et cetera. You will be diluted. Yes, it hurts. It's a tough nut to bite on, but it is a nut you have to bite on. And lastly, and I say this reverently to those with ideas because I've dealt with a lot of these guys and they're my friends, don't expect to stay as a CEO because you really probably don't have the network, the time, the ability to scale up operations and to hold others accountable. Cardiologists aren't really good at that in general. So I'll end with a finger in the water analogy. My dad used to tell me this. He said, if you want to know how important you are, put your finger in a glass of water, pull the finger out, and look at the dent you made. So it's very important to get it started, but remember, the water can be refilled by others. So thank you very much for listening.
This was a fantastic talk on it. And man, he really hit on a number of important items, and some of them kind of reinforce some of the previous things that have been mentioned. So for example, this idea about whether a physician with a full-time job is going to be well suited to be the CEO. And I mean, my sense is that the company as it starts, let's say in your garage, is really different than the company that now has full-time employees or maybe even has a device that is ready for commercialization. These are all different companies. And sometimes requires a little bit different team. And so I'm wondering, maybe I could come back to Kate Garrett and just ask, I mean, you've seen probably a number of things. You've been involved in the Stanford Biodesign Center. You've developed devices yourself. So how does somebody know when they've reached their maximum potential at a given position within the company, and of course realizing for the good of the survival of the idea, they have to now give way by bringing other people in, either to help them or to lead altogether? What's your sense on that?
Yeah, it's hard, and sometimes people don't know, which is one of the hardest things. And it comes back to a recurring theme, I think, that's been coming up during this event, which is surrounding yourself with great advisors who will not, just tell you what you want to hear, but will tell you what they truly believe. And sometimes, you have to hear it from other people because we don't always know that. There is a kind of classic saying in companies that most companies have 3 CEOs. You have kind of the startup CEO for the technical development phase. Then when you move into the commercial phase, that is a different CEO, because just by phenotype, they're very different people, different skill sets, different networks. And then once a company is already commercially launched and has gone through that rapid growth stage and is more at a stable and kind of steady state, that's a third CEO, because commercial CEOs that like that early, like fast-paced growth are different from the large. So I think it's just something that, as an entrepreneur, go into it knowing that it's not you, it's almost a fact that we're going, organizations need different leadership depending on the stage, and be aware of that. And I would, again, reach out to your advisors and ask, like, what does the organization need? Am I doing everything I can? Do you think we need to bring in some other skill sets?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Let me touch on something else that Louis brought up, and that is this difference between an iterative change and a transformational change. And there's nothing wrong with iterative changes. I mean, everything we use, we touch, we feel, we work with, we see every day is continuously being improved. But in the medical device space, any major, but still iterative change is going to require a whole new set of regulatory guidance, a whole new set of investment, maybe a clinical trial, and it may just not move the needle enough. So I'm just going to ask now an unanswerable question. So Sean, again, back to you. You're running a big department. You mentioned already your response to Shockwave, but let's just say you're looking at something new. How do you get that sense, like, is this really going to move the needle for my team? Do you put it in their hands and see what they do with it? Do you, I guess there's probably a lot of focus on clinical data. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I think one of, if you sit there and say what Brian said, and then you put it with Louis said, it's like, what need does it meet? I mean, I can tell you early on in my career, someone showed me a torque device that just flops on the wire. You don't have to load for that. And I thought it was the greatest idea ever. I'm like, and I can remember, it was through an IP startup at the clinic, and I went to every strategic saying, why don't you bring this? I'm so tired of, like, I have a 300 centimeter long wire and something loaded from the back. But the reality is, if you don't understand the opportunity and the market cap, what's going to take to make it, it just will never make sense. So it had a clinical need, it had a problem we were trying to solve, but it was never going to basically have return on investment for what it costs to bring it to market. So and I've also watched partners develop a company where they just hung on too long. They didn't want to dilute, they didn't want to give up, and they were not right at that time and just couldn't acquiesce to say, really to make it get past the hump. As Kate pointed out, and as Louis said, there's times when you just have to, to get to the next round, to the VC, they have the money, and you're not going to get there without the money. And so at some point you have to just have the really honest heart to heart saying, how much is it my own pride? How much is it the baby that I want to get over the edge? And those are tough things to figure out.
Yeah, it's a very true statement. So let me just introduce the next talk. This is by Andy Cragg. Andy's a interventional radiologist by training, but a true gentleman, extremely humble man with over 200 patents that it's invented so many things, both inside and outside the vascular system. And he's going to talk about how long does it take to get an idea off the ground and how do you build a team for your device.
It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I've already heard a few talks about the long scope of medical device development. It's quite daunting. I'm daunted, and I've been through this many times over the last 30 years. But I want to bring it back to the beginning, back to the young physicians who may be watching this online or in the audience here, and maybe inject a little bit of optimism in this process, which, as I said, can be quite daunting. I don't have much in the way of disclosures. So I want to talk to physicians, and because almost all medical technology ideas do arise from the mind of physicians. But I want you to stop for a minute and ask who you are, because I've been approached by physicians with ideas many times over the years. Many of them want to exit medicine, get in, as Dr. Cannon said, into the CEO role. My advice is to step back and say, who are you? Well, you're a physician, and I made the choice to stay as a practicing physician throughout the course of my career, even though I was involved in many startups. For what it's worth, I think that's what you should do. Being a physician really is a sacred calling for most of us, and I've always been grateful that I stayed as a practicing physician. So you can do this game, but you have to do it, as Dr. Cannon said, in a certain way. Now, what advantage do you bring to this whole process? There certainly are a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so what advantage does a physician bring? Well, there's nobody else who's closer to the pathology or the problem that you're trying to solve. And you, as a physician, are in the ring seat to come up with a solution to that problem. And sure, there's been lots done in this field and in many other fields, but there's always room for another good idea. And now comes my first admonition. This isn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It never really was. It was a little easier 20 years ago, but if you're going to get at this because you want to monetize your idea, you shouldn't do it, especially as a physician. You should start this first as a labor of love, because if you ever make money, and you might make a lot, it's going to be a long road. Another thing I've noticed is that anybody in the field, even with experience, has trouble understanding what your solution is unless you can make it real. And I've always put a high value on getting a prototype that will actually do what you say it should, what problem it solves. Now, you can do that, but it's also not easy. And if you want to go into this, you've just developed a new hobby. And hobbies can be quite involving. You're a full-time physician. Most of the rest of your time is going to be devoted over a period of maybe even years to trying to make this idea a reality. The tropes you hear, I wrote this on the back of a napkin and gave it to somebody, developed it in my garage, are just that. It usually doesn't work that way. I think you really need a small space as a physician to get yourself removed from your environment and work on your idea. You got to spend a little bit of money, and for the time being, before you find that angel investor, it's coming out of your pocket. But medical device development can be done quite economically now at the early stage. Advice number 2 would be to learn how to do CAD programming, for instance, so that you can take the idea from your mind, send it to a 3D printer, and make it real for somebody else. Eventually, you're going to find a creative engineer to work with. They're out there in most major cities, especially the medical hubs, and they can help you kind of rub the rough edges off your device and make it presentable to the people who are eventually going to fund your idea. Another trope here is you need a prototype and a patent to go forward. And there's a certain level of truth in that. It certainly was true before, but the patent industry has changed tremendously over the last 10 years. And I've become a believer that, along with advice from my patent attorneys, the only patent that really matters as far as your device is the one that covers the enabling step for your invention that's going to be used and stops others from doing that. And believe you me, when you first start, you're going to go through 100 prototypes before you ever figure that out. So don't waste your money on patents to start with and start patenting everything. The time will come. I think this is already touched on, but along the way you should ask yourself 2 questions. Will this work? Am I making a Rube Goldberg device that I'm in love with and nobody else is? And will doctors want to use it? That is a very colloquial way of bringing in what Brian talked about, the whole gambit of when it gets to the hospital, will doctors use it? But we're still on things you can do. So you can take your idea, make a prototype. You can understand the clinical problem better than anybody by knowing the medical literature cold. You can assess the competitive landscape. You already use all the competitive devices. So again, you're in a great position to understand what the benefits and downsides are of current technology. You can also learn to get into the patent literature and understand it, even write your own patents. It took me a long time, but I've, the last 10 years, written most of my patents, along with the help of a patent attorney, of course. And along the way, you'll find mentors who like what you're doing and will help you through the maze that we've already talked about that is medtech development. And time does go by. This isn't a quick process. You're looking at maybe 10 years sometimes for an idea to get from your head back to the hospital. And angel investors, you're going to come across, there are well-meaning people who like young people with great ideas, and you can find them. Plenty of incubators, a common word now, where you could, when you get to that point that I've just discussed, bring. And these incubators can take your device and bring it all the way up through FDA approval for a price. Contract manufacturers now are sort of soup to nuts places for medtech development. And they can take your idea, if it's the right one, and bring it all the way through FDA approval. Accelerators may help you actually do a startup. And you can stay involved in the startup, not as a CEO, but as a valuable contributor, all the while keeping your practice at the hospital. And if you work hard over those 10 years on that hobby, you're going to see a lot of signposts up the road that you didn't know even existed today. Clinical trials, regulatory issues, lots of financing, reimbursement, sales and marketing, and then maybe one day that device will make it back to your hospital where it'll actually help patients. But it has to start with somewhere. It has to start with you. And the next great idea may be in your head. And so you alone are able to translate that into reality, so get started. Thank you.
Well, Andy does make a good point about how long this takes, and anyone that's been involved in medical device development from the inside recognizes that. But there's so many from the outside that just think, I think, Sophia, you made a joke about it. It's like you thought it was $1 billion company right off the bat. Peter, I'm going to ask you, since you have had multiple ideas and now have commercialized and sold those ideas in addition to having gone through the process, and we can do a rapid fire across the board here and ask, what do you think the average amount of time it is to take a device through idea to commercialization, in your opinion?
Well, I think it depends on when you start the clock. But from the actual date of the idea to commercialization, probably 10 years is a pretty good estimate. And it's a kind of weird to imagine that, oh gosh, by the time something's new, it's already 10 years old. But, keep in mind, we live in an environment where, I don't know, is there another industry outside nuclear power that's more heavily regulated than medical devices and pharma? I think it's a pretty high hurdle, and the average device that's 510K approved can easily reach 50 or plus $1 million, and to do something that's a PMA approval may reach 100 or more $1 million. So that's a lot of heavy lifting for a lot of people to do to make your idea become a reality. So, and that's why you need the entire team that we alluded to.
Comparing TAC and Serenator, in your own experience, what was the difference between those two, time-wise?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a hard one. We haven't really talked that much in this seminar. I mean, this is a seminar dealing with issues at a very early stage, but we haven't really talked too much about regulatory. And there's a big difference between a 510K approved device that's based on a predicate versus a PMA device. Where it requires a pivotal trial to be conducted primarily in the United States. And I think that those two are it's almost like apples and oranges, even though it's the same industry, the same. One thing I just mentioned, I think that's maybe of interest for everyone, is that I really do believe that as our field that we love, of vascular and or vascular plus heart, as they progress and they become a bigger market, they attract more interest by potential investors. And I think back when a lot of the vascular work was not much in need of device development and it was a much smaller market, I think we didn't really have the potential to have the pace and the type of development that we do now, with lots and lots of money going into every aspect of vascular disease.
Great. Let's go to the last talk, and then we have some time for panel discussion. I'd like to get everybody to weigh in at the very end on a couple of interesting topics, but let's finish with what you just described, which is the intellectual property issue. And that is Hanson Gifford's going to talk to us about what it takes to actually go through intellectual property and what's the secret sauce for that. He's a managing partner at an incubator, the Foundry, and has done a lot in the medical device space. He's currently a partner at Lightstone Ventures. So let's hear this talk, and then let's finish with a good panel discussion.
It's been a great discussion so far. Really agree with most everything that's been said so far about the process. So these are some of the companies I'm involved with now, none of them relevant to the presentation. So at the Foundry, we have started a whole lot of companies over the years in many different spaces, many of them vascular. Because we don't have an existing business or a specific commitment to an area, we've had the opportunity to go out and learn about the state of the art and try to come up with new ideas in a wide range of areas. And we try to focus on the very best ideas. We come up with lots of ideas ourselves. Plenty of them are terrible ideas. And we are more than happy to bring in an outside inventor if those ideas seem like they will address a bigger need in a better way. But we really bring things from all directions. So I want to focus a little bit on the idea itself, because developing a strong IP position starts with having really good ideas. And doctor has an idea as he's performing a case, and that's really exciting, very self-actualizing, should make you really happy. And you should really cherish that, protect it, but also be free to challenge it you're going to have lots more ideas. Trust yourself, and don't defend that idea and prevent other people from saying how it could be improved or what's wrong with it and so on. It's really rare that somebody straight out of the box comes up with the perfect idea. It's really a process, and engaging in that process, learning what's wrong quickly is important. Sometimes, to relate to the Stanford Biodesign approach, what you've really come up with is just a new way of looking at a clinical issue, defining an important new clinical need, and that can be very valuable. That insight can lead to other new ideas that really become valuable over time. So, best way to improve your idea, to put it very simply, the Greeks figured it out several thousand years ago, is dialogue. You can think about your idea and challenge it yourself, but there's no alternative but to have other people tell you why it won't work, or how it could be improved, or whatever. And that can feel very challenging, but really focus it on the idea and understand why people think it won't work, understand the mechanistic reasons why something could be improved, or why you could make that better. And you should have all your discussions under non-disclosure agreement, not because you don't trust these people, but to document that you've maintained confidentiality of your idea, because once you make public disclosure, it's harder to get a patent on things. So our approach to the process is to take a very big picture view. And in your process, you should look at it from 30,000 feet, look at it from 1 millimeter away. Come at it from every angle you can, and file very broadly and very specifically. And you should move fastest on this. So one thing I want to emphasize more than any other is that developing intellectual property, it's a process, not a moment of inspiration. There's this flash of insight, but developing patents is the work of a team over many years. Even if someone else invented nearly the same thing first, you can build a very strong patent position through diligent creative effort. And that's, I think Andy Craig is saying the same thing, that you really can, as you develop the product, it evolves. You learn new things about it, and some of those details can be very valuable and end up being the point that really matters. I want to mention here also that patent rights aren't ownership of an idea. They're the right to prevent someone else from making, using, or selling that idea, which is a little different concept, sounds nearly the same, but it requires enforcement, and enforcement is a really challenging and expensive process that is filled with uncertainty, and actually it's very rare that patents actually get challenged and go to litigation, but everything is preparing for that moment. First step in filing patents is to write down your idea, and write it down in as much detail as you can. Think big picture, think detail, think about the procedure, think about it from the process of making the product, come at it from every way you can. And again, what you're really thinking about is addressing a clinical need. How else could you do that? What other energy modalities, what other chemistry, could you make it non-invasive, and so on? What little details along the way, what little detail as you think through in your mind the procedure could make that procedure easier? Then you start to look at other IP. Has someone else thought of this? What have they found? What new ideas does that bring to you? As you look at other IP, look not just at their issued claims, but also at what's in the specification to see what they could claim. If the patent still has an active application, they could circle back and file new claims to cover your device, possibly. So, as Andy said, you can file a patent yourself, but I would highly, highly recommend working with a really good patent attorney who understands the medical device space, who can take the time to really understand your invention and all the details, and understands the context of the clinical procedure, the development process, the cost of development, the process of working with strategics if you end up working with them, and so on. And the patent costs should be commensurate with the opportunity. And your attorney can help you understand that, should help you understand that up front, because it ends up being very expensive. So, first thing, file a provisional patent. It's very cheap, it's confidential. Do it quickly, because there is a lot of synchronicity among inventors. You think something just came to you out of the blue as you took a shower in the morning, but the reality is that there were antecedents to that idea that led you to that idea, and they're also out there for everyone else to see. So it's really common for multiple people to file on the same thing at the same time. Sooner is better. As you think through your idea and evolve it, file more provisionals, and then just before you hit the 1-year anniversary, take all of those and convert them to a full filing. And there are various ways to do that. There's standard filings, there's expedited filings to get issuance earlier. You can also go through the international patent process, which can delay expenses, but also delays learning whether you're going to get a patent or not. So claims are the most important part of patents, and having an attorney who can really think through how to claim your idea as broadly and as specifically as possible to really cover what's important is good. You can always get a patent. The point is to get something that really covers the most essential parts that make this a commercially viable product. Obviousness is an issue. Sometimes the patent examiners at the patent office will take 3 different, 4 different, 5 different patents and say, well, if I took a piece of this and a piece of this and a piece of this, then you can get to the same idea, and that's an argument that you make. So this all really becomes relevant when you get to patent diligence with an investor, an acquirer, et cetera. Freedom to operate is the most important aspect of this, proving that nobody else can block you from practicing. Patentability is also important, but I would actually really stress that freedom to operate ends up being most important. And it's all shades of gray. It's all subject to interpretation. It's a parallel universe separate from the real world of actual products, actual procedures, actual sales, and so on. Look very broadly for prior art, because other people are going to find it eventually. Better to look for that earlier. Everything you can imagine was done surgically 60 years ago and may have relevance to your patents. So I will stop there. Just mentioning this is an expensive process. A patent typically costs a couple $100,000. And so you might save a little money trying to file it yourself initially, but ultimately it's going to cost a lot of money. And that's why it's good to work with an attorney who can optimize that from the start. So thank you very much.
Another excellent talk on intellectual property, which of course every device needs to have sophisticated intellectual property. Well, I'm wondering, we're getting close to the end of our session now, and I just thought it might be nice if we could hear on an important question from each of the panelists. And the question I have in mind is, what do you think the main takeaway is from these talks that you heard about all these different aspects of early stage device development? And because, again, I'm asking another unanswerable question because there are just too many, I'll just tell you what mine is. And it's something I already know, and this, or knew, was that I think for us, people that have full-time jobs doing other things, that it really is a labor of love, that you come across a problem that really needs to be solved, and you've kind of gone down that road, and you need to get as many top-notch people to help you, and they all speak a different language than you, but it starts as a labor of love. So that's mine. Sean, what do you think?
I mean, I think you have to have thick skin. I mean, you're going to think your idea is the greatest ever. At every single stage of the way, you're going to feel like the weight of the world's upon you. And really, if you don't love and have the passion to move forward, you're not going to endure. And when it gets to the point where you've got to step away, you've got to love the idea more than yourself to step away, to actually to get it to success.
Well said. Sophie Kahn?
So as physicians, we're not used to hearing the word no, or it's not good enough, or it's too early, all these kind of negative things. And you have to just be okay with hearing it. It was really hard the first time I, kind of fell into talking to a venture capitalist before I even understood what VCs were. And I like blabbered on about this project that I was working on that I was so in love with. And he said to me very clearly, he's like, you're an academician and not an entrepreneur. And that was 2 years ago. And I, think about that all the time because I'm still standing 2 years later. You just got to roll with the punches. It's hard. It's a new endeavor because it's not, again, they don't teach you about it in medical school, but like both of you said, you have to really love it. And you just have to be okay with, rolling with the punches.
Well, you're on an excellent trajectory if you just heard that 2 years ago and you learned as much as you learned. So Kate Garrett, what do you say?
I would say I think it could be easy to watch all these presentations and be overwhelmed and almost feel like this is an impossible needle to thread, whether it's, the 54-point vetting process or the million no's you have to get to have a yes with venture and IP. I mean, I love Hansen. He's one of the best ever. And I watched that and I was like, oh my God. But the reality is this is a very well-worn path, right? So many of the panelists here and so many others have done this successfully. So I just want to leave the audience with the hope that there is a process to doing this, right? There are a lot of components, but it's a well-worn path. There is a process to do this. And I would just throw out the Stanford Biodesign website as a resource for you. There's a lot of materials online to help walk you through all the key components of getting through this process. And it's very possible, but it is challenging.
Great point. Aaron?
Yeah, I think to echo what others have said, I think what really strikes me too is the importance of the team from the get-go, and also how much that team changes over time throughout the development, from the idea to the product, and how it really becomes a living organism in itself that requires different people at different parts of the stage.
Well said. And Tony, back to you.
Well, I'll close with the fact that I think that always trying to think about where the puck is going is usually a great aspirational goal of physicians, because as we do procedures and as we see patients, we see needs. And I think never to underestimate the fact that your idea may actually be a really good idea. And to vet that with others is something that leads to medical device development in ways that are just as simple as something that you find that you might need, others will also find that they need. So don't be discouraged. The path is long, as Kate and Sophia and others have mentioned. But the thing is that if you have an idea that you really believe in, others will also follow along and just stay up with it. And I think you'll be successful. I just want to thank the entire panel. It's such a great conversation. Peter, thank you for co-moderating, and everyone for being here on a evening that you could have been doing something else. And I think we all learned a lot from each other. So with that, I think we can close unless there's other comments.
Well, thank you so much to everybody.
Great.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.